Hang on, Marco. There's like a lunar jet flying over this. Anyway, he could wait for a better spot.
The hand of the day.
Hey, what's up, guys? It's Alec Torelli. Welcome to a Hand of the Day episode where I'm reviewing all the big hands from Day 7 of the World Series of Poker main event. This one kicks off with button to big blind. Blinds are 200, 400K, and we have Ruzicka opens to $1 million on the button. 2.5 big blind open, which is a little bigger than normal, but I still like it. Puts a lot of pressure on your opponent right away. Threatening open. And big blind Shin calls with ace-7. So we got a standard open on the button with king jack of clubs. Call in the big blind with ace-7. So far, totally standard. We go heads up to the flop. Flop comes ace, 5 deuce with 2 hearts. Shin flops top pair, vulnerable kicker. And Ruzicka flops backdoor, straight draw, backdoor flush draw, basically king high. Shin checks, totally standard. Check, he's gonna check here 100% of the time, I think. And Ruzicka now bets 1.15 million into 2.5 million. Shin's play is totally standard. He's gonna be checking here 100% of the time. We have to expect that. So we really have no more information about Shin's hand. And Ruzicka decides to bet 1.15 million. Now I think some of Ruzicka's range is gonna check this flop, either for showdown value, hands like king high, maybe 5x, maybe pocket 7s. Some hands are gonna just check and pot control, or check to just hope to win at showdown, like king high specifically. And he's gonna be betting here with some hands like ace or some bluffs. Now if he's always betting this flop, then he's gonna be bluffing an inordinate amount of the time. He's gonna be having too many bluffs. So I think he has to be checking here some of the time, otherwise he's just betting too often. So I understand that Ruzicka's range is stronger than Shin's, because he could have more strong hands in his range. He could have 3-4 a little bit easier, and he could have all bigger aces, right? Shin did 3-bet pre-flop, so he can't really have ace-king, and he definitely can't have aces, and he probably can't have ace-queen. So I like betting from Ruzicka's point of view just because his range is stronger, but at the same time, if he's betting here 100% of the time, he's gonna be bluffing too often. My point is that Ruzicka has to be balancing his flop strategy between betting and checking. I'm fine with betting king jack here. There's a lot of turns he could double barrel. It puts a lot of pressure on his opponent. Maybe he gets his opponent to fold like a 5 by the river if he bets again on the turn. I'm okay with him betting the flop here. But the key to keep in mind is you can't do one thing all of the time, otherwise you're just too imbalanced. Some of the time he has to bet, some of the time he has to check. Anyway, he bets 1.15 million, Shin calls, flop totally standard as well. We go heads up to the turn. Pot is 4.8 million, and the turn comes another club. So it's an 8 of clubs, a great card for Ruzicka because now this is one of the cards that he can justifiably double barrel. Shin checks, and Ruzicka goes for a huge bet here, 3.4 million. Not a huge bet for like a cash game, but in tournaments, people generally, condense their bet sizes to something like between 40 and 60% of the pot. So anytime someone bets 3/4 of the pot, it's a little bit more alarming, just because people generally don't bet that big. They like to keep their stack to pot ratio smaller and have more wiggle room and sort of give themselves more opportunity to play different hands and so on and so forth. So anytime someone bets 3/4 the pot, it's a little bit alarming. Now I like betting this turn if I'm Ruzicka, because you have to be betting. If you're gonna bluff the flop with backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, you have to concede to betting a lot of turns that give you more equity. So if I pick up a queen, a 10, or a club, I'm probably gonna bluff one more time, hoping my opponent folds like king high or a 5 or pocket 7s or something like that. So I like betting here if I'm Ruzicka, because if you're gonna bet the flop, it's simply too weak to just go one and done. Your opponent might float you, and then he might bet the river if you check and you can't really call. So I like betting the turn here, and it puts a lot of pressure on your opponent. And even if he does call, you still have some bluff cards. Maybe you could bluff a heart, and you have some cards that you can improve to a flush and maybe stack him on the river. So I'm fine betting this turn. What I'm confused about is what to do if I'm Shin. This is a spot where, again, some players, they're never going to be double barreling here. They're just always going to check once you call the flop. And other players are always going to double barrel this turn with pretty much any amount of equity. So against the former type of player, I'm just going to let this one go. Against the latter, I have a very, very tough decision, because if they're going to bluff this turn, I expect them to be bluffing with any equity, which means like any 3x hand, like king 3 suited, queen 3 suited, jack 3 suited, etc. Any 4x hand, which is essentially the same, king 4, queen 4, jack 4, etc. And then any hand that has a straight draw, like 6-7, 9-6, those types of hands are going to be betting again. And then if you add in all the heart draws they could have, plus all the club draws they could have, you can see that if they're going to be betting this turn as a bluff with a draw, there's going to be a ton of draws they could have. And so my ace-7 is by far ahead of their bluffing range. This goes back to the flop a little bit. This is why some of the time on the flop you have to check, because if you're going to be betting all your bluffs, and then you're going to be continuing with all your bluffs on the turn, which isn't a terrible strategy some of the time, the problem is if you do it all the time, you're going to have too many bluffs here, and Shin could justifiably call the turn with ace-7 and crush the range of the button. So I'm okay with the bet here on the turn. My confusion is what to do if I'm Shin. I haven't seen that much of Ruzicka play. I don't know their history. I haven't seen like all the hands. So I don't really know what to make of this situation in a vacuum, just looking at this one specific hand. I don't know anything about Ruzicka. But if I'm Shin and I'm gonna call the turn here, I'm probably gonna call almost all rivers, because I'm just not gonna know when my opponent's gonna bluff. And if I'm calling the turn, it's because I think my opponent's bluffing often enough that I could call with ace-7. If my opponent's value betting, he's never going to value bet 3.4 million with a hand that I beat. He's going to have a bigger ace, a set, a 2-pair, or he's going to check for pot control or bet smaller with something like ace-4. Maybe he bets smaller, like 2 million, just to kind of like get value, and then keep his control in the hand in position. So when he bets 3.4, I'm either way ahead of his draws or I'm way behind his hands that he's betting for value. I maybe even drawing slim or dead. So if I'm gonna call here as Shin, I'm gonna call, and I'm just gonna sort of close my eyes and call the river, just because I'm not gonna know what to do. If a heart comes, maybe he's still bluffing and representing a heart with like king 4 suited, or just king 4 offsuit, whatever. Maybe if a club comes, he's gonna rep a club and he missed hearts or a straight draw. If the straight card comes, maybe he's gonna bluff the straight, missing his flush draws. So it's like I'm just not gonna know what to do on the river. Because of that, I may just fold the turn, even though I can concede to folding the best hand a lot of the time. But if I call the turn, I don't know. Maybe if I get a read on the river or something changes or he makes a huge bet, I might change my mind. But I'm sort of like, dancing with the devil calling the turn here, because I'm just gonna have to close my eyes and call a lot of rivers. Anyway, Shin calls the turn. So far, I don't mind how either player played the hand. Let's see the river. The river comes the queen of clubs, giving Ruzicka the nuts. Incredible river. Pot's about 11.5, 12 million. Shin checks, and now Ruzicka jams for 14 million. It looks like Shin sort of folds instantly here. I'm not sure if that's because of TV editing. Again, a lot of what you see on camera has to be taken with a grain of salt because of potential for TV editing. So in this spot, Ruzicka is essentially saying, I have a flush, or like maybe he's going for thin value with like at worst 2-pair, something like ace-5 at the worst. I think ace-2 is maybe even a little thin. If my opponent is folding 1-pair and I'm jamming ace-2, then he's only going to call with, if he's only going to call with 2-pair or better, maybe it's a little too thin of a shove. My opponent still could have a flush. My opponent could have like king-deuce suited, jack-deuce suited, maybe. And he could also have hands like 5x of clubs. So my opponent still could have a flush. My opponent could have a straight. He could have, maybe that's a little rare. He could have a straight. He could have 2-pair for sure. All of his 2-pairs are going to play the hand this way. He could have ace-5, ace-deuce, ace-8. And he could have sets of 5, sets of 2s that didn't check raise. And I think my opponent should be playing all of his 2-pairs that way to balance the times that he has these weak sort of 1-pairs. So I think it's reasonable my opponent has those hands in his range. He wouldn't have check raised them. But if I'm Ruzicka, or if I'm in Shin spot, I think Ruzicka should not be shoving here unless he has like basically a set or ace queen, maybe ace 8, ace 5 is a little like maybe. So I expect him to have like very, very strong hands or bluffs. I think this bet's a little polarizing. I don't think he's ever going to have one pair like ace king for value. If he bets like 4 million, that changes the hands that he could have. But when he overbet jams here, I almost feel like it's either more likely that he's bluffing or more likely that he wants you to think he's bluffing and jamming for value. The key is against, the thing to keep in mind is against a really good player or a balanced player or in a situation you've never been in before, you don't really know what the right answer is. So it's easy to get into the habit of leveling yourself and thinking, well, he's gonna make it look like he's bluffing or he really is bluffing, and you don't really have a way to know. Maybe you have unless you have a read or you've played with him before, you probably have never been in this spot before with this board texture, so you don't really know what to make of the situation. But at the same time, if I'm Shin and I'm just gonna fold here every time a club comes, then I'm probably also gonna fold every time a heart comes. I might fold every time a 3 comes. I might fold every time a 4 comes. And if I'm gonna fold on every river that completes a draw, I'd rather have just folded the turn. I understand that maybe he's gonna make up his mind on the turn. Make up his mind on the river and just call the turn and sort of see what happens. But at the same time, I think you have to be thinking one step ahead and say, okay, if my opponent's gonna bet the turn here, he's probably gonna bluff a lot of rivers, even if he doesn't complete his hand. And there's so many rivers that he could bluff, any heart, any 3, any 4, maybe any something like a 9, or any club. It's like I'm gonna have to fold so often. I probably would have preferred just folding the turn if I'm Shin, if I'm going to fold this river. So if I'm Shin, I might make a hero call here because I expect my opponent to be bluffing every time he's bluffing. Now this bet from Ruzicka is, if Shin is gonna be folding every time he doesn't have 2 pair or better, if he's never gonna hero call here, then I don't really like this bet from an exploitative strategy. If he bets something like 4 million, he's much more likely to get Shin to make a big call with like a 1 pair type hand, which it looks like Shin has. But at the same time, if he's always going to bet 4 million, then he's easier to play against, and it allows Shin to call the turn more often with these 1 pair type hands if he knows that he's never going to be put in a tough decision on the river. So in the long term, or from a game theory standpoint, I also like Ruzicka going all in some of the time with these big hands because it puts Shin to a really tough decision in every pot that he plays against Ruzicka, because he knows that at any time his entire tournament life is at risk. If he calls a bet on the flop and calls a bet on the turn, he has to be scared that Ruzicka is capable of putting him to the test. I guess what I'm saying here, and you can see I'm going back and forth and giving pros and cons for why betting small is good, why shoving is good, why calling from Shin's standpoint is good, why folding is good. It's like one of those situations where I don't like this play if he's going to do it every time that he's bluffing and every time that he's just value betting. But I like it if he's going to mix it up between bluffing some of the time and value betting some of the time. So you have to just be balanced here if you're Ruzicka. And the hard thing to analyze, the hard thing to observe from my point of view, seeing this hand in isolation, is I just don't know what Ruzicka's strategy is when he's bluffing. Is he never going to bluff this river? Is he always going to jam the river? Is he going to bet smaller with a bluff? And so it's hard for me to analyze the hand and say whether or not the play was good. What is important, and what I hope you took away from this video, is that you have to be keeping a balanced strategy in mind when you're making these plays. So if you're going to make this play with a hand for value, some of the time you gotta be bluffing here, otherwise your opponent could just fold unless he has something like a flush. If I'm Shin, some of the time I have to be calling here, otherwise my opponent could bluff me all the time and I'm never gonna have a hand that I'm calling with. So you have to sort of like protect yourself on both ends, and I think this is a really interesting hand. I chose this hand because it's so dynamic and there's so many different ways that you could approach it. And as you can see, it's not like poker is very cut and dry, where there's a clear yes or no answer for every situation. A lot of it depends on your overall strategy and how you're approaching these similar situations with all your other types of holdings. So as long as you're being balanced between how you're approaching it with bluffs and strong hands, or what hands you're calling with and what hands you're folding, I think the play could be argued as good by both players, and I'm actually okay with how both the players played this hand in the end. That's it for this hand of the day. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to my channel. I'm putting out a lot more video content coming soon to help you take your game to the next level. And that's it. Give it a thumbs up. Share your comments and a thought below. I'd love to hear what you guys think. How would you have played the hand? Would you call with if you're Shin? What types of hands are you going to call with if you're Shin here, right? What's the worst hand you're going to call with? I think that's something really good to think about. And if you're Ruzicka, are you ever going to bluff here? What's the worst hand you're going to bet here for value? Share your thoughts in a comment below. I'd love to hear your answers. I'm going through this with the plane. I hope you can hear me because I can't pause again. And that's it for the hand of the day. See you guys next time. Take it easy. Cheers.